By the way, because they decided to tell you hello, and we're already planning, and I'll talk to him next week, and probably Jim Hoff coming up also with him, June, July, we'll be discussing that. So, but anyway, Bill, where are you?
I'm right here.
There you are, over there on the side. Can you come up here, please? He hails all the way from Pennsylvania, and he was in St. Louis over the weekend speaking to a group of was it mixed men and women in Chesterfield?
Yes, mixed women. That's the coalition of women.
I am happy and proud to introduce a gentleman I've got to know mostly through email, right, but for the last few days, some conversations, and did a lot of homework before we committed to this. So I want us to give a warm welcome to Mr. Beaton from Pennsylvania.
Well, it's good to be with you. I've been in Quincy once before in my life. A long time ago I was here. It was probably about 1960 something, so it's many years ago. But I actually grew up in Illinois, so I'm kind of at home, and visited while I was in St. Louis with some of my relatives down in Sparta, Illinois, which is where I grew up many years ago, and always glad to come back to the land of Lincoln. Yes, I wrote a book. I'm not a writer by trade. I was a manufacturing manager of various plants around the country and retired about 10 years ago. And I was one of these conservatives, by the way, back in 2008 that was having trouble facing the idea of voting for John McCain. And a couple of you had that problem too, maybe. Well, at any rate, so after the Democrat primary, which had a little surprise in it, I bought a book called Audacity of Hope. And when I read that book, I said to my wife, I said, this is really big trouble. I couldn't believe some of the things that I read that this individual stood for. And immediately I went up to I live in Butler County in Pennsylvania, to our city seat, and went to the Republican office and got the listing of Republicans for Mars, Pennsylvania and Saxonburg, Pennsylvania, and for the first time in my life I walked both streets asking people to get out and vote for John McCain. So that book really impressed me and certainly got my antenna up as to what we might expect in the future. With that as background, if you think about 2008, we had heard for years about how bad the economy was. You know, it got almost sickening. Every night on the news we'd hear about Bush's failed economy, and it was as bad throughout those years when Bush was there as every economy we'd had since the Great Depression. So as we got into 2008, some things started happening that really caused me to do some research. The one that really set it off was the morning of September 15th of 2008. And if you read my book, you'll see I really feature early in the book the discussion about what happened to Lehman Brothers, and we'll talk about that a little bit in detail here in a few minutes. But that morning when I got up, the stock market was crazy. I think I was down 400 points or 500 or something like that. And very shortly thereafter they said that Lehman Brothers had announced bankruptcy at 2 a.m. that morning. Now that literally made no sense to me, because my wife had worked for JP Morgan there in Pittsburgh whenever they bought out Bear Stearns. And I must admit to you, I really didn't understand what was going on at that point in time. But I knew that whenever Bear Stearns got in trouble, a much smaller company, by the way, than Lehman Brothers, that, right or wrong, the Federal Reserve, along with the Treasury, you know, between Geithner and Bernanke and Henry Paulson, put up $29 to $30 billion to backstop the bad mortgages, which we learned to call toxic loans and toxic mortgages very shortly after that, so that JP Morgan could buy out Bear Stearns and avoid a bankruptcy. So whenever Lehman went down, I had to find out why it was different. If you might recall, a week before Lehman went down, something else big happened that people had said for years, including Barney Frank, Chris Dodd, and some of the other illustrious people in the U.S. House that were involved with the financial part of our economy, that the government would never have to take over Fannie and Freddie, would never have to have taxpayer money bail them out. And on September the 8th, it was announced that Fannie and Freddie were being taken over by the federal government, and they're still in conservatorship to this day. And I think they're up to, what, almost $200 billion of taxpayer money now that is taken just to keep them afloat. which, while, by the way, they're continuing to do the same thing as they did to get in trouble as well. So those two events together caused me to start thinking, why did this happen? And started communicating with a few friends. Now I'm going to skip to February of 2009 because the third thing, it happened on September the 18th, that was not published and really has not been published in our mainstream media to this day. There was a run on the currency that the congressman from eastern Pennsylvania named Kanjarski, who's no longer there, he was defeated by a great guy named Lou Barletta, fortunately, last November, or a year ago November. Kanjarski made a C-SPAN, and on that C-SPAN he talked of a run on the currency of September the 18th that, had it continued for 12 hours, would have brought down the entire United States financial system, and had it continued for 24 hours, he said it would have brought down the entire world system. So now what we had was September 8th, September 15th, September 18th, and in the book I call it the ultimate October surprise, by the way, because if you recall, after those dates, and even George Soros, who we'll talk about a little bit today as well, even George Soros said that as of September the 15th, whenever Lehman went down, the economy sunk like a stone, quote unquote. That was his words. And after that, there was another event that changed. On September the 8th, it was the only week, the only day in the polls for the presidential election, and don't forget there was a presidential election going on, that McCain and Palin actually had a 2-point lead in the polls. After September the 15th, the election was basically decided. So with that, I started trying to find out, how did this happen? So I went back and started looking at housing. And as we all know today, housing was very instrumental in causing the financial crisis, the Great Recession. And so I started looking to see what transpired. So I went backwards. So I thought, well, maybe if I go back to 2000 and find out what's transpired, I'll get the answer. So I went back, and what I basically found in the 2000s was a number of bills that were brought forward by, typically, the Republicans to improve the regulation of Fannie and Freddie. Very little was said about Wall Street, but a lot about Fannie and Freddie. Every one of those bills was blocked, and the last one that was of any possible benefit to heading off the mess that we had, in my opinion, was in 2005. And in 2005, that bill as well came out of committee 9-9 and never went to the floor. I wish they'd have taken it to the floor and made everybody vote, but they didn't because of the threat of the filibuster and that there was no bipartisan support for the bill. Particularly of note is the fact that our current president was sitting in the Senate in those days, and he was absent on that vote. He did not vote to bring any of the regulatory bills that were brought forward into play. So then I went back further, and there were a number of other bills in the 2000s, all had the same reception and the same result. I believe there was, it's reported there were 17. I didn't try to look at all 17. I did look at some of them, and in fact they did all have the same MO, frankly. So then I went back a little bit further to the 90s, because I didn't have the answers to what caused it. And in the 90s you find two pieces of legislation that are absolutely astounding to me at the time. One in 1992 and one in 1995. The one in 1992, we'll start with it first, because I knew that we were onto something when we found it. It was a bill that was being processed at the request, really, of George Herbert Walker Bush to create a strong regulator for Fannie and Freddie, because there was concern about Fannie and Freddie going back really many years. 2 weeks before the election, an amendment was added to that bill, the election being the election between Clinton and George Herbert Walker Bush. An amendment was added to that bill by a Democrat senator that basically started the deregulation of mortgage lending standards. Have you heard that in the mainstream media? No. The bill, and I cited and I recorded in the book, step by step talked about the word deregulation, and the title of the bill was Deregulation of Mortgage Lending Standards whenever that amendment was added. And I thought, wow, I've never heard that before. By the way, I went into this trying to be nonpartisan, And I was surprised to find what I found in terms of deregulation, because everything I'd ever read, this was caused by Reagan. I still read it today. I just read an article yesterday where we were talking about the cause of the housing thing being Reagan-type deregulation. So then I went to the 1995 bill, which was just another step up from that. 92 bill, which created even lesser standards for mortgages, which led to eventually the Alt-A type, the zero down, the payments at nothing but interest, and even some so bad that they didn't even pay the principal on the loans. And this eventually led to the toxic assets, and eventually led to Wall Street getting involved. And by the way, the first bill that Wall Street got involved with, or the first mortgages, was 1997. And in fact, it was done with the backing of Freddie Mac. And so I thought that was kind of revealing too, that Wall Street didn't really get into the game until rather late, whenever the mortgage lending standards were already being destroyed. Also in the latter 90s, a guy named Andrew Cuomo was working for Clinton, and the objective was constantly to get more low and moderate income housing. There was a study in 1995, and then I'm going to go back a few more years, whenever the task to this task force was given to come up with a way to improve the number of mortgages that they could place. The result of that task force, and I quote this in the book as well, basically said we've got two major problems. The first problem is that these people don't have a down payment. That's a slight problem for a mortgage, or it used to be. It said the second problem is if they had the down payment, they didn't have enough income to make the monthly mortgage payments. And then it concluded this is the problem we've got to solve. Yeah, it's really kind of humorous in a way, isn't it? And yet, that's kind of what they did right after that. You know, they basically took people with nothing down, inability to pay, even quit eventually in the latter 90s, even verifying whether people were employed, and it led to really a tremendous boom in terms of the amount of mortgages, or I should say bubble probably, because in 1997, there was about $3.7 trillion in outstanding mortgages, and by 2007 it was up to 11 trillion. It was just unbelievable what happened during that period of time. But I still didn't have the root cause as to how we got there. So I backed up a little bit further. During the Reagan era, truly not very much happened. It was kind of quiet. And Reagan was very clear that he didn't think the government ought to be involved in supporting mortgages. He made that clear when he was still governor of California, and continued while he was in office. However, if you go back to 1977, you find something called the Community Reinvestment Act. Now, a lot of people say that's the root cause. Definitely it had a lot to do with it, because it was that bill that was continuously modified. It was that bill that was modified in 1992, again modified in 1995, to gradually break down the lending standards. In itself, I've often thought that the 1977 bill wasn't all that horribly damaging, because it didn't have the deregulation of the 92 bill and the 95 bills for sure. And with Reagan there, it basically allowed for growth of mortgage lending consistent with what had transpired before. There was no big blip up like you saw after the 90s. So that became one of the key items, but yet then I wanted to know, why did that bill occur? And I went back further, and I ran into some people that we'll spend a fair amount of time talking about, and one of them was named Cloward and the other one was named Pivot. Because Cloward was instrumental throughout that period of time in seeking ways that he could overload the financial system of this country, and he was supportive of that Community Reinvestment Act, and even more so, in another 1992 bill, he was supportive of the Motor Voter Act, and that was basically what he considered to be his lifetime's achievement, was whenever the Motor Voter Act was signed by Clinton. So I got back to the Cloward people, which led me to the 60s, and I really put the root for the mess that we've had and even ongoing today to some of the events that occurred in the 60s, not the least of which was the Cloward-Piven push for destroying capitalism and replacing it with a socialistic, totalitarian type state. They call it a Democrat state, but certainly a socialistic state. Now, initially I thought, how could these two people have that much influence? And then immediately, in starting to find out what they did, I ran into what Cloward was doing with Acorn. Because in 1969, a group was formed in Arkansas, which by 1971 was converted into Acorn, with two people named Wiley and then Wade Rathke, who was involved with Acorn right up until recent years. And that was Cloward's creation to try to start the community organizing efforts that he felt were needed to eventually overload our system with something. At the same time, Saul Alinsky's book came out in 1971, Rules for Radicals. And we see, as we looked at what was transpiring in those years after that, the combination of Cloward and Piven pushing to do everything they could to overload our system, and also the community organizing efforts of Alinsky, which basically led to Acorn joining on the street side in the latter 80s to try to force banks into making loans to low and moderate income people that the banks would not have done otherwise. This accelerated during the early 90s, and then I started asking, well, how does this tie into the leadership of our country? And basically what I found was Acorn working directly with the Clinton administration. Whenever those studies were done, like the one in 1995, Acorn was involved. And when the Motor Voter Act was signed, that's when I found out for sure that Bill Clinton was involved with the Cloward-Piven people, because nobody's ever invited me to go to the White House and be a part of a signing statement. But there's a picture that I have in my computers. Whenever Bill Clinton signed that act, that Cloward and Piven are standing right behind him, which says that Clinton was involved, knew them as far back as the 1992 era. Now, Cloward and Piven also were professors at Columbia University during the years when it's alleged that our current president was a student there. Nobody really has any evidence that he really was there, but it's claimed that he was in Columbia at that same period of time. Now, if he was there when Cloward and Piven were there, which is kind of interesting. Now, I want to talk about Piven a little bit, and then we're going to talk a little more about the other causes related to what happened in September of 2008. Because Frances Fox Piven was an activist from the 60s on. She was part of a group that was created in 1963 and still is to this day, called the Institute of Policy Studies, which I'm going to talk about a little bit in detail when I start talking about progressivism. Because all of this eventually led me to these radicals that started changing the way our country's culture and our country's belief system was in the 60s. And I do see these people, along with the Alinsky approach, a lot of other things changed in the 60s too, but these people were heavily invested in changing our country, eventually leading to what I call the modern day progressive movement. So with that said, let's talk about Frances Fox Piven for just a second. When she was involved with the Institute of Policy Studies, she would constantly talk about what needs to be done to create equality. Not equality of opportunity, equality of outcome. Very recently, she showed her colors again with the Occupy Wall Street. You might have seen a video that she showed up back after they started in October in Manhattan, on the streets with those people, praising them for what they were doing and giving them encouragement. So this woman in her 70s now, or maybe even early 80s, is still actively working to undermine the very system that most of us have appreciated and have helped us through our lives. Also, she last year, December 22nd, wrote an article that was widely published where she said in that article, where are the angry mobs? Where are the people in the street? Why do we not have the riots like Greece does? Where are our people? And just look what's happened since then in the last year. And there she is again on Occupy Wall Street. So these people became very key in working constantly to undermine the very existence of our government as I've known it throughout my entire lifetime. Now, with that, I started thinking, what are the real causes of the housing crisis, and spent about 7 chapters talking about what I just said to you, going through the legislation, listing the types of legislation, who passed them, and step by step building to the roots being back in the 60s. Having found the radical involvement of people like Clark, Piven, Acorn, what the Acorn people and other community organizers did in terms of sitting in at banks, disrupting their businesses until they agreed to make loans, I became very interested in the very, very significant radical groups, particularly the one that I call the progressive movement. Now, this says Democrat Party at the top strictly because the progressives in the U.S. House of Representatives all reside within the Democrat Party. That's what this circle here refers to. And the reason I've chosen this group of progressives is because these people sit in the highest seats of our government today. The Congressional Progressive Caucus, when I wrote the book, had 83 members. All 83 were Democrats. Today, there's 75. If you recall, after the last election, Pelosi said we won the election. Remember she said that? She said it didn't make sense on the surface. She was talking about the progressives. She is the queen of progressivism. And of those 83, only 5 lost their election last November. But the Republicans really beat last November were the Blue Dogs. Now, within this circle is something called PO, and that's House Bill 5808, which in the last Congress was the public option bill. Never got out of committee, but what it would have done is go right past Obamacare and created a government-run public option bill directly. It never got out of committee, but it had 129 co-sponsors. So I wanted to know who those were, and my wife and I sat down, and sure enough, all 83 of the progressives naturally were on there. And there was 46 other people, again, amazingly to me, all of them being Democrats. Of those 46, only 2 lost their election to a Republican as well. So when Pelosi said we won the election, she was absolutely right. All those people are still sitting there waiting for the day, again, where they can have the power to do what they did the first 2 years of Obama. And that's why it's so important. I heard the prayer today that we get the change in November of this year because they're all sitting there. Now I want to talk a little bit more about the caucus and what it's tied into. I mentioned Institute of Policy Studies starting in the 60s. There are a ton of these organizations. A lot of you probably watched Glenn Beck and know about TIDES and the Apollo Group and the Center for American Progress. You know, there's just a slew of them out there. The reason I choose this one is that after the election of 2008, 2 days after the election, the Institute for Policy Studies people were having a meeting celebrating the election of Obama. It's on a 55-minute video, by the way, that if you've got a strong stomach someday, you know, go to their website and bring it up. Last I knew it was still there. It is hard to watch it because those people absolutely make my hair stand up on the back of my neck as they sit there and celebrate what they're going to do to our country. But at any rate, in that 55-minute video, one of the key players that was there was the administrator of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. Now he was there so he could report the results of the election to the Institute for Policy Studies as to how many new progressives that we had elected in that election of 2008. And that was the whole discussion. As a part of that discussion, one part of it stands out that I want to relate to you. Because they were talking about some of the election results that still weren't finalized, and particularly one up in Minnesota. And if you recall, in Minnesota we had Coleman running against Al Franken. And whenever the polls closed, the numbers were 725 for plurality for Coleman. But that called for a recount. And so these people were talking about what was going up in Minnesota. And one of them said, well, that's one of our people up there. And what he meant was, their Secretary of State up there, Mark Ritchie, is one of the Soros people that is sponsored by this group at the bottom of the page, that I'm going to talk about in a minute, called the SOS Project. And when they talked about their people up there, you could kind of hear them chuckling that this kind of be interesting to see what's going to happen. And sure enough, they were chuckling in the right way, because right after that, what, 400 and some votes were found in somebody's trunk, and a few hundred more came along. And as I recall, we got the illustrious Al Franken with a 225 or 235 vote plurality. Just absolutely unbelievable that that could have happened, to have an Al Franken in our Senate. What's even worse about that, as things turned out later, he became the 60th, the supermajority voter for Obama and the Democrat Party to shove Obamacare down everybody's throat. And that just, that little part of the story just is amazing to me to this day. Okay, I talked a little bit about the Institute for Policy Studies. They do a lot of other things. They are a very scary group of people to me, and do listen to their video if you can. They're involved with Agenda 21. Terry asked me to mention a few things about Agenda 21. You know, it's a UN-sponsored kind of activity. Sounds good because everything is sustainable communities, sustainable transportation, sustainable financial, you know. And it sounds like they're doing something good, but what they're really doing is attempting to intrude into everybody's life in every country around the world. And it all started in 1982, and I did give Terry a copy of a handout that a lady had given to me about a month and a half ago when I went to one of her classes, because she's had some real experience with it. And there was a few copies back on the table back there where my books are too. I don't know if they're all gone or not, that you can pick up. But in 1982, the Agenda 21 was created with the intent of finding inroads into municipalities, counties, cities, states even, but typically bypassing the elected officials and working through either chambers, local business people, or whomever they could find that might be appropriate to start a project that would be doing something to determine a sustainable type definition. Right now in the United States, they have a pilot program on sustainable communities with 9 communities chosen called the STAR program, where these communities, working with money that's flowing from various groups that are supported by the UN in some form or fashion, maybe even through our government, and probably so in some respects from what I know, that they are in fact trying to establish the standards for a sustainable community that then they can take to other communities across the country and across the world, and somehow probably continuing to use financial activities to intimidate people into joining their groups, and also to intrude into the activities of locals. One of the communities on that 9-city or community list is right next door to me, and I didn't know it until 4 weeks ago. And it's a really fast-growing community, and they're part of the STAR program and have gone through the first 3 levels. So I'm going to be watching it very closely. I know the city supervisors there, and see what really is transpiring with them. But I think the key thing to think about is that these people also are determined that they have the right answer for how we should live, and that's what came out of their meeting and creation meeting in 1982. And a group called ICLEI, don't ask me what it stands for, it's ICLEI, was involved with writing Agenda 21 at that session. And they're also involved today as implementing it, and it is that group that is working with this sustainable definition for the communities. The reason I bring that up when I'm talking about Institute for Policy Studies is I just found out today, I picked up a new book from 90-year-old aunt I have down in Sparta, Illinois, who's followed this for 20 years. And I found that a gentleman named Jack Kavanaugh, who is key in the Institute for Policy Studies and has been for the last 20 or 30 years, was at that 1982 meeting and is listed in their book as one of the key contributors to the Agenda 21 activities that when it was initiated back in 1982. And by the way, their 20-year anniversary is this year in 2012. This is a meeting down in Rio, by the way, and their 20-year anniversary is going to be a big meeting this year down in Rio as well. So they're really working hard to bring that agenda into communities around the country, typically using money to buy their way in to establish footholds that they can build on the future. To me, they're very similar to the progressive people who are doing much the same thing. So that's the Institute for Policy Studies. They also have people there that are big on Islam. They've written a 9 or 10-page article called Islamophobia, where they defend the activities of the Muslims in our country and basically would accuse anybody that even is suspicious of them of being an Islamophobe. So this group, Institute for Policy Studies, is the one I really suggest always to people to learn about them and keep an eye on them. Off to my right, your left, is a group called PFO. Anybody know what PFO stands for? Progressives for Obama. Now, this is another reason why the progressive movement is so important. This group shares board members with the Institute for Policy Studies and the other group over here called the MDS as well. And it was created to help Obama defeat Hillary initially. And there's a document, by the way, their website's gone, even though I sourced it in the book, it's gone now. I have documents in my possession where they wrote that they supported Obama over Hillary because Obama is a better progressive than Hillary is. Now we know that Hillary is a progressive. She says she's a progressive. Obama actually went to Wisconsin a couple of years ago and celebrated being there where the progressive movement was founded. And frankly, in my mind, Obama is the head progressive today with the Institute for Progressive Studies, the Congressional Progressive Caucus, and all of these groups following right in his path, is sitting there hoping that they get one more term to be able to finish what they started in the first 2 terms, that we have at least got to the point where we can block them today. We don't have enough power to change it today, but they're looking forward to having that opportunity again. So that's what PFO is about. And by the way, you find Frances Fox Piven there as well. You find her in all of these across here. She is a very quiet instigator of many of these activities in support of various senators, the president himself, and these groups. Another group that really alarmed me when I found it is called MDS, which is Movement for a Democratic Society. And I don't know if you can read what's in the box up here, but they have people on their board that they share with the Institute for Policy Studies. And it also is worthy of noting on their board are 4 people who are card-carrying members of the CPUSA, which is the Communist Party USA. Part of the title of my book came from a book written by J. Edgar Hoover in 1958 called Masters of Deceit, where he was warning the American people that the communist movement was not dead. It was there, it was infiltrated, and it would rise again whenever the opportunity was there. And here we find those 4 people there. I'll admit to you, when I first wrote the book, I was reluctant to even say this until October the 2nd of 2010, whenever the communist and socialist parties rolled out their banners in front of the Lincoln Memorial. Remember that? After Glenn Beck went there on August the 28th, then here come the counter in preparation for the election. And there were their banners, proudly displaying their Communist Party and Socialist Party. 11 members of that board are Socialist Party of America people. A number of them are old SDS people like Bill Ayers, Bernadine Dorn's on the board of several of these groups, by the way. And also a number of them are from the Weathermen. They're the gray-haired Weathermen and SDS people of my generation. Down below the MDS, you see another arrow going down to something called the SDS. This is the modern-day Students for a Democrat Society, created anew by these Movement for a Democrat Society people in 2006. The last I checked the website, there's 150 college campuses in our country today that have an SDS chapter now. all done within the last 5 years. On the website of these young people, they declare themselves to be a radical organization. Very proudly, right at the start, they consider themselves a radical group. They were created and sponsored by the MDS, so you know what the intent with these people, these young people, is in the future. Now, across the bottom, I talk about several other things that are worthwhile, which this led me to George Soros, and that's why you see George Soros' name at the bottom. If you haven't caught up with George Soros, you got to catch up with him, because I really see him pulling the shoestrings of basically everybody in the Democrat Party today. His groups like MoveOn.org proudly proclaim that they bought the party. After the election when John Kerry failed back in 2004, the leader of MoveOn.org, a guy named Ely Pariser, said, relative to the Democrat Party, we bought it, we own it, and that's the way they've treated it ever since 2004 as well. So Soros is in the business of trying to buy elections. Soros is in the business of trying to manipulate currencies and manipulate governments. Two things are worthy of saying about him here. You see at the bottom something about Democracy Alliance. Back in 2005, some people call it the Phoenix Group. He created a group of billionaires and millionaires that were intended to finance projects approved by the board of the Democracy Alliance that would influence the government and influence the policies of our country. To join this group, by the way, if you're interested, you need $25,000 as dues to get in, $30,000 a year to stay, and you have to commit to finance projects of $200,000 minimum per year that the Democracy Alliance approves of. This group is active throughout much of the country today, particularly in the battleground states where I come from, and that's in this group over here on the my far left, called the Progressive Majority, is a group that sits in Philadelphia today, and they basically have the objective of training progressive-oriented people to fill every elected office in the state of Pennsylvania. According to their website, they have now trained over 1,000 people to fill school boards, to fill local election commissioners, to fill the state jobs, as well as even Congress and senators. And in fact, we do know that 2 of their graduates ran for the U.S. House in the last election. Fortunately, they got beat, both of them. So that's what Soros has been up to. And then I put the SOS project down there, and I just want to tell you about it a little bit more. Yeah, they put Al Franken in, but what is it? Soros decided after what happened in Florida that it needed to have the counting done a little bit better for elections. So he started a project to support the election of Secretary of States that would count more appropriately. And that's where Mark Ritchie came from, up in Minnesota. And at one point they had 7 of the states with a Soros-elected Secretary of State. Only 2 of them got reelected last November, fortunately, so we're better off now than we were before the November elections, but you can rest assured that Soros and company is still thinking in the same direction. The money is still there, and he will keep his hand in our election process in any way that he can. I do not conceive in any way that with the progress these people, led by people like him and Obama and the rest of that group that sits up there in the executive branch of czars and whatever else they are, that there's any way they're going to give this up easily here in the next year. I expect the next year to be one of the most difficult years that we've ever seen in my lifetime, and particularly, Walter Williams wrote an article just this last week that I saw where he basically made very dire predictions as to what might transpire if it looks like that Obama or Hillary, if she ends up being a substitute, if it gets too bad for Obama, if it looks like they're going to lose. He wrote something that was really, I'm sure, quite a challenge for him to put in words, because he's usually pretty mild, but he really expects that things could be violent if it looks like that those people are not going to be able to win their election. And they've come so far that it's hard for me to imagine, too, how they're going to back away, because If last November hadn't happened, in fact, I give the Tea Parties tremendous credit, the 9/12s and the Tea Parties, for having delayed the Obama agenda enough that he couldn't force it through when he had the supermajority. I truly do, you know, because I think if without the Tea Parties, the 9/12 groups, and all of us that went to Washington, how many of you went to Washington? Imagine a lot of you did. I think I've been there 5 times myself to try to do what we could to demonstrate that we, the melting pot people, don't agree with what's going on. Okay, with that, I'm going to wrap up here with a couple things. As far as the overall Great Recession, housing crisis, and so forth, I ended up trying to put it into a nutshell to where I could talk about it so that maybe people could understand a little bit. And I came with 3 categories. The first category that I saw as a driver was a combination of 3 groups, being the mainstream media, Wall Street, and the Democrat Party. They are all one. And I'm talking the National Democrat Party. I'm not talking states and local. It's a totally different group. But the party at the national level of John Kennedy and Harry Truman is gone. You know, I remember them, and they're not, that party is long gone. I often say, Democrats, take back your party, please, because we need a 2-party system, at least for a while, you know, that can be focused on helping our country build on the past, not transforming it from something that we really don't even understand. So that's the first group, those 3 working together. If you think about those 3 together, you get another thing too. If you think about socialism, you can't have a socialist state if you don't have the press, and if you don't have the money, and if you don't have the executive branch, can you? And I didn't do it for that reason, but after I did it, I realized that one day that was the necessary #1 combination. The second driving force I call the progressive movement and radicals, and I do consider the progressive movement very serious. The radicals are everybody from Acorn to the Alinsky people, the communists, the socialists, everybody I talked about. The third group is Soros and New World Order. And Soros is big on the New World Order. He clearly supports the Agenda 21. And basically, his view is open borders. His view is basically that the United States needs to be taken off of its pedestals. One of the quotes that I have in an overhead presentation, he said, the United States is the greatest impediment to world peace, and it needs to be taken off of its pedestal. This bubble of supremacy needs to be burst, is another phrase that he uses. You know, this naturalized American is doing everything he can to transform America in a way to move us away from free enterprise, capitalism, independence, individual control to a socialistic state of some sort where the power is vested in a fashion where he can influence what transpires, and he makes that very clear in some of his quotes, and I have a lot of that listed in the book as well, where he wants to influence what is transpiring. With that, I have a little group that we got together, and they said, my book is too long for a lot of people to read, and we need to do something else, because I would constantly get the question from people, you know, what can I do? And we have a number of things that we talked about, what people can do. I have a good friend that I do a watchdog radio show with, a half an hour every Saturday morning in Pittsburgh, and he buys the half an hour. And he appointed me as co-host about 6 or 8 months ago. By the way, we're #1 in Pittsburgh for our half an hour on Saturday morning. It's kind of interesting. He was so excited. He was so excited, you know, and I'm pretty conservative, you guys, but his name's Todd Marley, and he's to the right of me. And by the way, if you ever want to hear it, you can go on the internet. It's on watchdogradio.org, and he archives them all. But that's the kind of thing that we talk to people about as we go out. That there's a lot of things. You know, use your talents. You know, I'm not an author. I didn't mean to write a book, but whenever I saw all this, you know, people kept saying you got to write it because other people don't know it. So eventually, I tried to write it. I had 3 or 4 editors that helped me to make sure the words went together appropriately, and the book was the result. I forgot to tell you, by the way, the book was initially published by me, because I don't have any notoriety as a writer or a political figure, either one. And then Tate Publishing, a fine Christian publisher, they normally do Christian things, but they also do documentaries, which the book is a documentary with 777 sources in it. picked it up and they published it nationally last October the 11th, and it's now available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and on the internet, and Alibri, and every place else. And then I found out very recently, I was telling one of the ladies earlier that one of the people that we know that my wife was trying to keep secret this because of work reasons, all right? I think you probably understand that. We're trying to get our address and put my name in, and up popped the book. Came in and said to my wife, I didn't know your husband did that. And she was scared to death for a while, but she still got her job anyway.
That's good.
So let me finish here real quick, okay? As I am going to wrap up. So we made a little booklet that contained things like doing a radio show, writing articles, because there's a lot of people, and probably some in this room, that do that. And then we put together a little, I call it a pamphlet, but my wife says anything with 70 pages can't be a pamphlet, it's a booklet. And we've got a little booklet 4x6 back there where we put together what we thought was important for our president, senators, or anybody else to do. And so we put this into the booklet and wrote a little article about each one of them. 8 things that we're for, starting with patriotism, sovereignty, and so forth. 2 things that we oppose. As you can probably tell from what I said, we oppose progressivism very highly, see it as a serious, serious threat. But Obama has to go first. Number 1 is Obama. Opposing the New World Order ties in with our thrust for sovereignty. If you listen to the Soros people today, they want to undo our sovereignty. Somebody mentioned it to me, the responsibility to protect created by a Soros-funded group again in 2001 is something that reverses the definition of sovereignty the way we've known it historically, that the nation is not sovereign, the people are. And whenever the people are threatened, it gives us the right to go in and attack Libya. Or it gives us the right to go into, where are we now? 100 people into 100 Marines or somewhere in Africa. There's a rumble that we might be talking about doing something in Syria to protect the people. So it sounds good, accepting that who's going to make that decision as to who goes across whose border to go in and do the protecting. So that's what's in this little booklet that we have. I basically, if you do 25 or more, I sell them at my cost, which is $1. That's what I paid it for them. And but we do have them individually as well. So with that, I thank you for your attention. I think it is a critical election. Defeating Obama is primary. Got 23 Democrat Senate seats that are up that we need to do everything we can to help those states with those. And the progressive movement is third.
You are. And how Bill found us was actually when there was a bunch of us when this president was in town and we were singing God Bless America, and that's how he had seen when it was publicized across the country. So I know there's some questions, so we'll give you time to answer them, and then we'll give it back to Vicki. But thank you so much for coming.
Well, thank you guys for listening, and it's a privilege to be here. You know, I go everywhere that I can, and yes, I did see that on TV, and it was very remarkable. I still had the mental picture in my mind of some of you who probably were sitting there along that roadway and being pretty unceremoniously moved away, and yeah, kind of rung in my mind. Okay, you had your hand up, sir.
Sir, I understand Mr. Soros said that elect Romney or Obama, the policies would be about the same. What's your take on that?
I think Mr. Soros is right now trying to change his colors from a couple of ways, and it's been apparent, I think, in the last 3 or 4 weeks that he's trying to act like that he is not supportive of the left the way he has before. He recently recently wrote an article where he said, and I'm going to come back to your specific point, where he said, I'm really not too interested in being involved with this politics thing, and I really only got involved because of George W. Bush. And if it weren't for that, I wouldn't be involved. I wouldn't have been too interested, which is an absolute blatant lie, by the way, because he was there in the Clinton administration constantly trying to get a hearing. And I quote him in the book because he was asked by somebody, I can't remember who right off, if he would get a hearing with Obama. And he said he thought he would certainly get a hearing with Obama, and he was asked about Clinton. He said, well, he said, I got a hearing with Clinton, but he said I never was able to influence policy with Clinton. So, you know, and here he is just very recently making this grandiose statement, only because of terrible George Bush did I ever get involved. To your comment about the two are equal, that masked, in my opinion, that masked the progressive leftist movement by trying to make everybody look the same. You hear some people say the Republicans are just bad as the Democrats. I can't find a Republican that's in the progressive movement. And I say everywhere I go, because people will say to me, they're just as bad. And I say, I can't find them. You tell me who they are. And I see him doing that as a way to try to make Obama look better at the expense of Romney, and there's nearly no comparison between Romney and Obama, regardless of what you think of Romney. There's nobody on the other side that even looks like Obama, and I'm not talking physically either, don't misunderstand me, in terms of policy or behavior. That's my read on it. As Soros is trying to change right now, just as Obama is, all of a sudden Obama is starting to sound like a conservative. You know, and kind of messed up with Civilius, I think, with the Catholics and Methodists and a few others of us, but that's what I think. And it seems to me like that tone has really changed since the State of the Union. And Soros' article I mentioned to you maybe came out 2 weeks ago. And it just hit me right between the eyes. I said, this isn't Soros. But now he looks like a philanthropist again. Because people are learning who he really is, which will hurt Obama. The more people that find out what Soros has done in terms of supporting Obama and the Democrats and the progressives behind him, the more it will hurt him in that election coming up. I might say one other quickie too, relative when I put Wall Street together with the mainstream media and the Democrats.